Okay, so everyone, welcome back, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion just like we did last week, or 2 weeks ago, shall I say. So this week, what I'm going to do, or today, I'm going to speak about the question of Ottoman reformation. And the question of Ottoman reform is closely linked to the idea of Ottoman decline. This is something which is interesting because when I speak to many Muslims who are trying to make sense of their place in the world today, they would place the current situation and then look at the Ottoman past from a perspective of Ottoman decline. This was something which was conveniently framed by particular Ottoman historians like Bernard Lewis, and this has been heavily challenged by Ottoman historians in the last 15 years by making the case that the argument of Ottoman decline is actually not reflective of what happened in the Ottoman period. Nonetheless, even though historians continuously are making the case of the idea of Ottoman decline being problematic, students, the general public, and Muslims more specifically, are still, they still view Ottoman history within the framework of Ottoman decline. So clearly there's a disconnect here. I was interviewed on a podcast a few weeks back, and the interviewer, who was Muslim, asked me, okay, so I want to talk to you about Ottoman decline. And I said to him, what would you like me to say? Would you like me to profess my academic experience in the field that I'm in as a PhD graduate and as a doctor in Ottoman studies? Consistently, we are being trained with the evidences that we are seeing that the idea of Ottoman decline is problematic because it was framed within an ideological framework. Yet if I present that, Muslims to some degree find a sense of offense because naturally the Ottoman state collapses. The point here is that what we're doing is we're looking at because we know the end of the story, which is that the state collapses, we then teleologically go backwards and then join the dots to show a sense of decline. What we are trying to say as Ottoman historians more pertinently is that power, authority, and states in particular are very fragile, and we don't appreciate their fragility actually. What we assume, because of the way states project their strength and authority, that these states will always be here forever, these power structures will always be here forever, and that they will always remain. But what history teaches us is that no empire, no entity has been around forever. Politics, to some degree, is the management of multiple factions, peoples, institutions, and conditions, internal and external, that are constantly changing. And as a result, the combustion or collapse of an entity can happen at any moment. It can happen because of sickness. It can, so the pandemic is an example of that. Currently, as historians, we're talking about the history of pandemic. Pandemic culture, when we look at it as historians in the past regarding pandemic culture, they have really shook the foundations of states and institutions, because pandemics don't generally stick around for 1 or 2 years. They're usually around for a decade. This happens in the Roman Empire to the Justinian Empire, for example, where even though they had removed the epidemic in Constantinople at the time, the sickness just kept moving around constantly. And what it does is it kills morale, it kills motivation, it wipes out particular generations of people. So there is a politics of pandemic in which that can expose the fragility of states. And the reason why I'm explaining this point to you is very few governments at this moment in time are coming out positively from the politics of pandemic. Societies are generally frustrated and they're critiquing the government. So the point I'm trying to make to you is wars can do this. Something like World War I is the example we give regarding the Ottoman period, which is World War I was a defining moment which facilitated the combustion of the Ottoman state. The Ottomans had reformed to a level which would have made the Ottomans, to some degree, they would have permitted them to survive a lot longer than they did had it not been for World War I. And consequently, when we look at World War I, we then not only see the combustion of the Ottoman order, we see the combustion of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, we see the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, so the combustion of the Russian state in the way that it was configured. We see, as a result of that, World War II, and so then we see the combustion of Germany, which was Prussia at the time, the British Empire, the French Empire, and the rising of the United States of America. So what we have to take into consideration is that to some degree, World War I was an anomaly that created a particular condition of which virtually every state had some sort of combustion moment. But by and large, people are still seeing this moment as a reflection of centuries-long decline. And for us, that's a little bit troubling, because if I was to ask you today if the United States of America is in decline, or are the Russians in decline, it's a very hard assumption to make. I mean, how do you look at that in that sense? And now we can start going back in time and say, okay, you know, Nixon, Reagan was shot, JFK was murdered, Trump coming to power. But in reality, states are very robust, they're malleable, they have the capacity, especially empires, to continuously transform and transition. And that's what the Ottoman state was doing. So it's important to understand that. And I feel like whenever we're teaching Ottoman history, one of the frustrations we have as Ottoman historians is, while we're trying to teach that the Ottoman decline narrative was a narrative, and it's not helpful to look at it from the decline perspective, people still look at it from that. And the point is because, one, we look at empires as rise and fall. So they start off, they go up, there's a peak moment, and then a decline moment, and a collapse moment. And in Ottoman history, that's perceived from the perspective of Suleiman the Magnificent, when the Ottoman state, in terms of landmass, was at its largest. So what we're seeing here, or the assumption we're making, is we're discarding culture, we're discarding education, we're discarding intellectual discourse, we're discarding language, societies, cultures, and religions. And what we're looking at is landmass as a reflection of power, of the Ottomans being at their highest point. In reality, when we look at the 19th century, more people were educated in the Hamidian period. There was far less conflicts in regards to confessionalism. We had a unique intellectual class, and we had a renaissance in Ladino, Armenian, Ottoman Turkish, and Arabic in regards to language. So here you can see that in the Hamidian period, while the state was smaller in size, to some degree, what you can see is the state in regards to its, in terms of society and institutions, was far better equipped than in the period of Suleiman the Magnificent. So in that sense, it comes to my second point. Is it fair to make comparison between periods? And once again, as Ottoman historians, we find that a little bit problematic. So we're critical of the decline narrative, and we're critical of the idea of a golden period, that there are golden periods in particular moments in history. And so this is one of the things I wanted to put forward, because when we talk about Ottoman reformation, is often seen within the framework of the paradigm of decline. The other thing that decline is often seen in is from the perspective of a universal West. This negates the idea that European powers were in constant conflict with one another. And so as a result, there wasn't a uniformed West and then the Ottomans versus them in that sense. So that is something we have to take into consideration. One of the questions is, when we talk about the Ottomans, is that a lot of Muslims, by and large, who study Ottoman history on, as amateurs, generally look at works or realities and scenarios of the rest of the Muslim world and make the assumption that the Ottomans were going through the same experiences. Predominantly India. There's a lot of work written on the Asian subcontinent in particular, and what Indian Muslims went through regarding the colonization of India, and they make the assumptions that the Ottomans were going through these same experiences. An example, the printing press. There is an assumption that the Ottomans were lagging behind regarding the printing press in regards to what happened in Europe. That's not the case. The Ottomans, a lot of Ottomans, in particular Armenians and Jews in particular in the Ottoman Empire, were practitioners of the printing press, of which the Muslims had no problem with. There is an assumption then that the religious establishment, the ulama, were anti-printing press, just like they were in India once again. Once again, this is not true. What we see is that many of the members of the ulama had different and varying positions regarding how they felt regarding the printing press. What they were critical of regarding the printing press was the printing of the Quran, because in those days, Quran manuscripts were written by hand. And so there was a feeling that those people who were writing the Quran by hand would lose a connection because of the printing culture. And an example of today's reality could be that the muezzins in the mosques, if we said to them that we would just use a tape, that a tape will be sufficient and we no longer need any more muezzins, straight away you would find that Muslims would find that problematic. So the printing press had some of these components to it, which the Ottomans were careful about. But by and large, the Ottomans, once again, this is a huge, like, I don't know how it's stuck that the Ottomans were anti-printing press, because there's a lot of works suggesting otherwise. There's works of self-criticism that we have to be careful of. What I mean by that is throughout every decade and century, you're always going to have social critics from the intelligentsia who are always going to critique their society, who are always going to critique their government, who are always going to critique the situation that they have in their country in comparison to someone else. That's just a constant throughout history. And what people do is they read this criticism culture and they make the assumption that this is a reflection of decline. What we as historians are trying to do is we look at that criticism culture and then we look at the reality on the ground and say, do these match up? Are these reflective of that? So an example for you guys would be, if we read today's Daily Mail, for example, in the United Kingdom, in 20 years' time, is that really a reflection of what's happening on the ground in the United Kingdom? Many of us would make the case that that's probably not the case, that there's a lot of exaggeration, there's a lot of what you can say agitation created in the printed press as a way of facilitating its readership. Well, self-criticism culture was similar in that sense, where there's a heightened sense of agitation. And the reason that exists is because when people do self-criticism, one of the things that they're trying to do is they're trying to look towards a particular future, but at the same time, they create the imagination that the past was better than today. And so what they reflect on is that they will make the case that in the previous sultan's period, it was better than the periods you have now. So this is an important point that I need to stress. The other thing we see is in the secondary literature, which is that we've accepted the fact, we spoke about this last week, a lot of the literature in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially during the period of the United States struggle with the USSR, in which capitalism was competing against communism, there was a need to construct a framework of modernity, a sort of Western modernity, in which a host of Eurocentric narratives came out in the way other societies were viewed. In that sense, there's a lot of narratives regarding the Ottoman past that are framed within Eurocentric narratives. Then obviously there's nation state narratives in that sense. And that's something that Ottoman historians once again have to deconstruct. So that's another problem we're having. And finally, there have been contributions regarding post-colonial studies, challenges to Orientalism, the introduction of subaltern studies regarding how we can view Ottoman history. Once again, the wider public is alien to these sort of like shifts that are taking place in Ottoman studies. And now more and more thinkers are talking about the idea whether Ottoman studies needs to go through a particular form of decoloniality, and if that's possible. The complexity regarding the Ottomans in particular is the Ottomans were neither a colonizing state nor a colonized state. They were very different. The way that they operated, and especially when we see in the Balkans, it was a client-based system, which was that power was reciprocal because it was based on a sort of relationship in which the Ottomans were accepted as particular forms of power, but power was very local. And the reason why I'm explaining this now is because now when we look at reformation, I want you to understand that the Ottoman Empire straddled across 3 continents, the Balkans, Anatolia, or today's Turkey, the Hijaz, and the Arab provinces like Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. It's impossible to assume that the Ottoman state was a centralized state like today's nation state. So most of the times, authority was very local, and it was left in the hands of local leaders who would negotiate with Istanbul as a center. Istanbul's influence in these various areas was minimal in the 18th century. The idea that the Ottomans would try to centralize the state would create fissures within Ottoman society because there would be forms of agitations. However, after the advent of colonialism, what we start to see is that the Ottomans have to make a choice. Leave the current system the way it is, which is a decentralized system where authority is localized and in the hands of local leaders, or aggressively centralized, upset the local population, but then in some way, survive the colonial expansion. And this is where the Ottomans have this complexity, right? And this is something that people don't understand. So I did a road trip, for example, in 2010, where I went by road from Bosnia to Cairo. And it's only then that I start to imagine and understand the complexity of what it means to live in empire. The terrain is different, the language is different, the people are different, there's multi-ethnic areas in a host of different areas, different types of people, different types of food. It's exceptionally complicated. And what people do is they view the Ottoman state as if it should be one universal whole. And it wasn't like that. The Ottoman state had nomadic areas, it had urbanized areas, it had areas of different linguistic groupings and peoples. So an example, in 1908, we had a member of the Young Turks who came from the Balkans, Thessalonica, and they were asked to be a governor in Baghdad. And the local Muslims complained because the way that he was practicing Islam in Baghdad was different than the way that it was being practiced in Salonika in that sense. And they said, he doesn't understand our culture, he doesn't understand our customs. So the point I'm trying to make, on the one hand, it was a multi-ethnic empire, but on the other hand, there are forms of localizations that even other people in the domains didn't understand or appreciate at times. That is the nature of what empire was. And I want you to appreciate that there was no other empire like it in that sense in the world at the time. There just wasn't. And this was a very unique empire in that sense, in the way they operated. So when people make the argument, how comes the Ottomans fell behind the British or the French or the Russians, they're not taking into consideration the uniqueness of the Ottoman project, which was one which was very different in the way that it operated. Now, how was Britain, France, and Russia in particular able to advance beyond the Ottomans at this particular point? Well, one thing is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a very unique sort of European event that took place, which the Ottomans were a little bit detached from. But the other thing was what we could call the paradox of war. And I explained this to you guys before, that the Ottomans in the 17th and 18th century were what we call in moments of peace, which was there was no war in the Ottoman period internally or externally. Yet the French were at war with the Russians. And so what happens is when you have this conflict between the French and the Russians, on the one hand, you are fighting each other, competing with each other. On the other hand, because you're in this continual war, you need to improve your war tactics, your machinery, and your artillery as a way of surviving in this war. So it's a strange, vicious circle in regards to war, which is, on the one hand, war is taxing, exhausting, and it depletes your resources. On the other hand, by being in a continuous state of war, you're always at the top of the sort of like tree in regards to techniques of war, weapons of war, and what should be done. Nations and entities that are not in war will naturally get left behind because they're not practicing those methods of war because they're in periods of peace. And so this is what's happening in the Ottoman period in that sense, right? If the Ottomans are in this moment of peace, what we do see in moments of peace is consolidation. There is a consolidation happening. So we often look at the idea of expansion, but we don't look at the idea of consolidation. There's only so much you can do regarding expansion. There has to come a moment where you consolidate ideas, cultures, languages, and literature in society. The 17th and the 18th century are known within Ottoman history amongst Ottoman historians as moments of consolidation. The improvement of people's identities, the need for improving literature, the need for improving traveling, people's living conditions improved, and so forth. This can only happen when the empire is not in a period of war. Having said that, the empire is in trouble, mainly because the rest of the surrounding regions around it are in continued flux. India is colonized by the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, shall I say, and the French have ambitions in North Africa in regards to its colonial intentions. As a result, the Ottomans are now in a tight bind. What do? Do they compete with the colonial powers by replicating methods of colonialism, or do they maintain the integrity of their own culture and try to make adjustments? Well, one of the things, or they could do what the Russians did, is what we call autocratic modernization. What we mean by that is that the Russians were not thinking of colonizing in the same way as the British and the French, but they used aggressive modernization and aggressive centralization by basically sticking it to their society. In a way, what I'm trying to explain is something similar to China, which is that China doesn't really take into consideration the needs and interests of its society. It's just moving very quickly, very fast to modernize as a way of surviving in the current capitalist world so that it can compete with the United States of America. That's exactly what the Russians had done. So the Ottomans have now viewed Britain and France in particular improving because they are able to colonize other nations. subjugate those nations, use the resources of those nations to strengthen themselves. And then they're watching the Russians in particular improving in the sense of using aggressive autocratic policies as a way of centralizing so that they could remain up to speed with what's happening in the European nations. The Ottomans hesitated to do any of the two. And this is part of the problem. It was the hesitation because the concern was by moving in this direction that locally society would not accept it. And so this is where the Ottomans are stuck at. What's interesting is when the Russians and the French go to war with each other, in a strange way, the irony is both the Russians and the French improved their military structures to such a degree that when they stop fighting each other and they turn on the Ottomans are in a position of weakness militarily, because now the Russians and the French in particular are in an exceptional space of military advancement. And we can see this with the Russian encroachment in the Balkans in the 1770s and so on. And we can see Napoleon's invasion in Egypt as a result of that. And so now the Ottomans are in a bit of a situation, a bit of a bind. And so this is now we're starting to see why the Ottomans, to some degree, out of desperation, have to make a choice. Initially, what they try to do is they try to gradually introduce reforms to the domains. But when they attempted to do that, there was an agitation with the well-established Janissary Corps. So for those of you who don't know, the Ottomans established a Janissary unit, which was a particular, what you could call professional military unit. But by and large, the Janissary operated mainly in Istanbul and parts of the Balkans. When wars were done in other parts of the domains, it was usually left to the local populations to find local soldiers to defend the domains in the way they saw fit. Sometimes Istanbul would send soldiers from Istanbul to those areas to double up the numbers to help them. The problem with that is because the Ottomans didn't have a centralized army in that period, and a lot of local militiamen were being used by local leaders, there was a sort of disconnect amongst this military class. So different soldiers would turn up and different chains of commands and different types of people. And so we had a lot of moments of what we could call friendly fire and disunity amongst the Ottoman soldiers. So as a result, Istanbul was in a bit of a bind. How do we centralize our military across the board? The only way they could do that was to either remove the Janissary and create a new military, and then force the local leaders to comply to the centralizing policies of Istanbul, or simply continue the way that they're going right now, but they would obviously lose a lot of territory to the foreign powers. 1774 is the changing moment. It's called the Treaty of Kuchu, which is when the Russians defeated the Ottomans and annexed the Crimea of the Khanate of Crimea. And this was the first time that the Ottomans had lost an area where the population were predominantly Muslim. And this sent shockwaves in the Ottoman system, because now they didn't know how, they were being accused of not being able to aptly defend the domains as a Muslim empire for their main Muslim subjects in that sense. So the Ottomans now, in an act of desperation, know that they need to reform their military if they're going to survive. What's interesting in this moment is a host of Russian Muslims who migrated to Istanbul became incorporated within the Ottoman system. And the reason why the Ottomans did that, because firstly, there was a sense of guilt of the loss of the Crimea. The second thing is a lot of the men who left the Crimea were intellectuals, military men, and the elite nobility of the Crimea who came to Istanbul. So Istanbul found a way of maximizing them by being able to use them. Because whenever war happens, one of the things that you realize is that the intelligentsia and those who can afford to move first. And generally the general population gets left behind because they don't have the means to do so. And in the Crimea, we have a schism to a certain degree, with the population that left behind not wanting agitation with the Russians because they knew that the Russian treatment towards them might be harsh. But then the intelligentsia who are in Istanbul trying to encourage Istanbul to improve its military to be able to safeguard its own interests. And so now what we're seeing is in the new intelligentsia by the Russian Muslims encouraging to create a military unit that replicates something similar to what they experienced against the Russians. The same thing happens in Egypt with Mehmed Ali Pasha, who notices when Napoleon's men invade Egypt, that they will have to use a military unit that is similar to the methods that are being used by the French. So both in Egypt with the French encroachment and in Istanbul with the Russian encroachment, the Ottoman domains in its two axes of the two centers in some ways, Istanbul and Cairo, start to realize that there is a need for military reform. Military reform then is not simply a reform of the military establishment, because anything that happens in power trickles down into society. And as a result, we now start to see that the military reform naturally has consequences in regards to how people view religion. And what's interesting here is in Istanbul, for example, you have the Naqshbandi movement, who are very pro-military reform. And you have in Azhar, in Egypt, once again, the ulama being very pro-military reform. So there's a recognition that military reform is necessary. What's interesting is members of the ulama who wanted to maintain the status quo did not want military reform. And the reason being is because within the Islamic culture and tradition, they were concerned that if the Sultan created a new army, he would become absolutely powerful, and as a result, strengthen his authority locally and subdue the other factions within the Ottoman domains. The reason why this is important to understand is because the Ottomans had what we call constitutional traditions to make sure that the Sultan, the Janissary, and the ulama, none of these institutions had absolute power. As the Ottomans attempted the reform, there was a revolt, and Sultan Selim III was executed. So when Mahmud comes into power next, he realizes that it's difficult to appease the locality and the local sort of like men of power. And so he went down the direction of the Russians, an aggressive form of centralization. His belief was that if I didn't do this aggressive centralization, that the empire would not survive. So he eliminated the Janissaries in 1826, absolutely massacres them as the only way of survival. He eliminates local leaders in many areas. He confiscates property as a way of funding the centralization effort. The only way he could fund the centralization effort, because the Ottomans were not colonizing, was to increase the level of taxation against his local population, because that's the only way they were going to make money. So they increased that. And they used that money to improve the techniques, weapons, and the material needs of the Ottoman military. By doing so, Mahmud, in 15 years of his 30-year rule, quickly established a uniform Ottoman military, which was very unique. But a consequence of that was the local populations got very agitated, exceptionally agitated. And one of the calls that local Muslims started to make against Istanbul was the need for justice, that this was unjust, that we should not have been taxed in this way. There's no right for the Sultan to tax us aggressively. The Sultan had no right to abolish the Janissary, and the Sultan had no right to confiscate land as a way of improving the centralizing efforts. And as a consequence of that, Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt rebelled against Mahmud in Istanbul, and you have an internal war and conflict between the two most powerful men in the Ottoman domains. And this shakes the foundations of the Ottoman domains, because here you have, on the one hand, a sultan out of desperation trying to save his empire by any means necessary, and a local strongman who also accepts the need for reformation, but is not going to accept the manner in which the reformation was being done. And so here, this is where the Ottomans are in a bind. And I think sometimes people don't appreciate this, which is when you're trying to make reform and change in an eclectic empire of that nature, you're not going to keep everyone happy. For anyone who's worked in an organization, and when a new boss comes in and says, we're not going to do it like this, or like I support Liverpool Football Club, for example. And when a new manager comes in, he takes out his whole staff. New staff comes in, new players come in, and so forth. And when that happens, it creates a sense of agitation in the club of what's going on. Senior players start complaining, old staff say what's going on, and so forth. So imagine the desperations the Ottoman had, which is on the one hand, they knew they needed to centralize because of the encroachment of Britain, France, and Russia. But on the other hand, the only methodologies that were left to them was this aggressive centralization and reformation, which would create a sense of agitation from the local population. And we can see this, let's just say, with COVID in the United Kingdom at the moment, where the state is deciding that it's going to vaccinate the majority of the population, and care workers are going to have to be vaccinated, and teachers are going to be vaccinated. And people are complaining that this is against our civil liberties and our rights. The state does not have the authority to do so. So the point I'm trying to explain to you guys is I want you to understand that centralization and reformation is not easy. It's not that the Ottomans were behind necessarily from the Western powers. It's that the Ottomans were competing with various Western powers who used different mechanisms and techniques. And the problems the Ottomans had is that internally their culture didn't allow them to use the same methods and techniques in terms of their ethics and morals. When they did use a similar technique to the Russians, it created an internal sort of like contestation, which nearly brought the Ottoman Empire to its knees in 1838. So what we have then is, in 1839, we have a document called the Gulhane Edict. And the Gulhane Edict was basically a document written to basically apologize to the masses by telling them that we heard you loud and clear. And so just to make it clear, Mahmud dies in 1839. His young son, Abdul Majid I, comes into power as 18 years old in 1838. And so they put out a Gulhane document, which is read in the Gulhane Park in Istanbul, which is talking about equality amongst all the subjects. It talks about that people will not be forced into conscription. It talks about that people will not be unfairly taxed, and that land will not be confiscated. This is the closest you're going to get to an apology by the state in that sense. And the state is basically apologizing for the methods it used, the desperate methods it used as a way of centralizing. However, having said that, as critical as we are towards Mahmud II, what he did do is leave behind an empire that could now be easily centralized. And so what we have now is a bureaucratic state, the emergence of an Ottoman bureaucratic state. What happens in the Ottoman domains then is now we have local governors chosen from Istanbul, who have local councils who are elected by the local populations. And the Ottoman state becomes a very bureaucratic state because of the previous sultan's aggression of centralization. The second thing is the Ottomans can no longer tax its population for money, no longer can it confiscate land. So where does it get money from to continue its reformation? Well, the only choice it had left to not upset its population was to take out loans. The only place it could take out loans was Britain and France. And so they took out loans from Britain and France. So people keep asking, why did the Ottomans take loans from the British and French? That's the reason. They took out loans from the British and French because they could no longer tax their local population. Because unlike the British and French, they didn't have an infinite tap like India, where they could just keep taking resources. The local populations wouldn't tolerate that or handle that in that sense. So the Ottomans are now in a very difficult situation. Having said that, these the money that they took from the banks, basically they used it to improve the educational system, and they created new schools that could run parallel with the madrasa system. Now, a lot of people get surprised about why this was done, and the earlier Ottoman narrative was presented that these were secular schools. Ottoman historians now say that it's incorrect to call them secular schools because education is just education and knowledge is just knowledge. So what was happening in these schools? To take the burden away from the madrasa system and to allow the madrasa to then focus on matters to do with religion, these new schools would teach translation, would teach technocratic education and engineering and science and these sort of subjects. As a way, that doesn't mean that in these schools religion was not being taught. Religion was still being taught. The other form of education that people had was the military schools, in which still people were being educated in military schools. And another form of education was the Ashirat Maktabi, which was that leaders from local Arab leaders would be asked to send their children to Istanbul as a way of being educated in Istanbul and then sent back to the Arab provinces as a way of having a sense of connection between Istanbul and the Arab provinces and having a sense of loyalty between the populations in that sense. And the last one was the Esnaf culture. And the Esnaf culture is interesting. Esnaf is basically craftsmen, traders, people who are cooks and chefs and so forth. They would have a particular, musicians including, would have a particular culture where they were taught their skills from generation to generation that had a religious component to it. So they would always be polite, kind, and so forth. And so what you saw is people were given the options of various forms of education within the Ottoman domains. They could have a traditional religious education, they can go into a technical education, they can have a military education, or they can have an education within craftsmanship. We then start to see the improvement of the taxation system. We then start to see a filtering down of improvements in literacy. And it's from this moment onwards that the Ottomans start to embrace the telegram. Electricity becomes part of the Ottoman domains. And we start to see the printing press starting to become far more prominent in this period. And so with the printing press and education, we start to see, as I mentioned before, the development of language within the various societies. And because these were multi-ethnic societies in many ways, you can see a host of borrowings taking place between different peoples. In the 19th century, what's interesting about Ottoman Turkish in particular is it starts to increase its number of loan words from Arabic and Persian. So there's not a decrease, but an increase that's taking place. What's interesting about that is that we start to learn that Ottoman Turkish is not a language of colonialism particular, because it's negotiating with two other language groups. Why is that happening? Because in the 19th century, what's interesting is while the Reformation is happening, the Ottomans also have a sense of re-establishing their Islamic identity, because now they are the only Muslim empire that exists in the world. So they become the bastions of Islam in the world at that time because of what's happening with the other colonization. And so there's an heightened feeling of their Islam in regards to their identity. And so you see a intensification on the Islamic identity in the Ottoman period. So it's really intriguing in terms of that. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because the early historiography tried to make the case that this was a period of secularization. And yet when we now, newer historians are making the argument, this is not the case. In fact, the secularization narrative was a deliberate narrative created to facilitate the creation of the nation state. That's not to say that there wasn't a hybrid taking place. The Ottomans were learning from the Europeans. The Ottomans were taking ideas from the Europeans. But on the same token, many indigenous people were also learning from their local indigenous cultures in that sense. What I do want to stress, and people don't appreciate this, what we do see in the Ottomans is an emphasis on tolerance and coexistence between the different peoples in that sense. And while it wasn't perfect and there were tensions, nonetheless, tolerance and coexistence was important for the Ottomans. And as a result of that, the Ottomans constructed the idea of what they call Ottomanism as a way of competing with the nationalisms that were coming in Europe. The idea of Ottomanism was to create an umbrella identity, which was to say that while this is an Islamic empire, nonetheless, no Ottoman subject who is non-Muslim would be marginalized or subjugated as being a second-class citizen because they all belong to the Ottoman domain. This was new regarding the this was new in regards to what you could call identity constructions. The Ottomans, prior to this, never felt the need to construct identity in this way. But now, with the Ottomans needed more and more non-Muslims to be part of the military establishment, the Ottomans needed more and more non-Muslims to be part of the administration and the bureaucracy. It was only fitting for the Ottomans to create a what you could call a umbrella identity that can encompass all Ottoman subjects as belonging to the Ottoman domains. Ottomanism, to some degree, you can argue, was an imperial patriotic bond rather than a nationalistic bond. And it was designed to be loyal to the Sultanate, to be loyal to the general land of the Ottoman domains, and to be loyal to your locality, or what they call watan. So everyone had a local locality, which was interesting because they had this concept of wataniya, which is they had buyuk watan, which means the great watan, which means to belong to the Ottoman domains, and then kuchuk watan, which means the small watan, which means to be loyal to the local domains. And these were not in contradiction to one another in that sense. What we say in this period is we move away from the idea of center and periphery, and we have a provincial system of multiple centers. So we don't have one center in the Ottoman Empire. So Salonika is a center, Beirut is a center, Cairo is a center, Jerusalem is a center, Baghdad is a center, Konya is a center, and Istanbul is an Uber center in that sense, that connects all of these centers together. And so what you see is local centers being connected to other local centers. So Aleppo was connected to what you could call Urfa, and Cairo was connected to Alexandria, and Beirut was connected to Damascus. So you can see, and then Damascus was connected to Haifa. So what you start to see is how these different centers were connected. And because people were continuously moving, because this is an empire of migration, internal migration, it created a sense of belonging in many people's minds. And then that was superimposed and super reflected by the print medium. The newspapers allowed people to start to imagine what it meant to be an Ottoman citizen, because for the first time, different peoples were reading about different peoples across the domains. However, the Tanzimat reforms, to some degree, still didn't help the Ottomans of restricting Russian and European encroachment in the Balkans. As a result of that, when Sultan Abdul Hamid II comes to power, he then emphasizes the need of emphasizing on the Islamic identity over the identity of Ottomanism, mainly because the majority of the non-Muslims of the Ottoman domains were lost in the Balkan Wars, and the empire becomes predominantly Muslim. Once again, though, while Sultan Abdul Hamid is emphasizing this, the state is very careful of not marginalizing its non-Muslim populations. Under Abdul Hamid, you start to see the intensification of the creation of trains. The trains, once again, in the Ottoman period, in the Ottoman state, were very differently used than, say, in India. Whereas in India, the British used the trains to move slaves and tools and produce and so forth from one end to another, in which the local population were not free to use the trains in the same way. In the Ottoman domains, the trains were used by and large for moving pilgrims, what we call the Hijaz railway station, and just moving peoples from one place to another. I'm not going to say that the trains were not a space of privilege. Not everyone can afford tickets, so I have to be fair here. I'm not going to, say that. But it's interesting how the Ottomans were using even railway in a different way. In World War I, it is also true that the Ottomans were using the trains as a way of moving soldiers from one end to another. And this is where you get Lawrence then of Arabia, what we know, blowing up the railways to make sure that the Ottomans couldn't move the soldiers in that same way. So what we see in the Hamidian period is a continuation of the Tanzimat policies of improving education, reformation, and what Abdul Hamid was skilled at was balancing the foreign powers. And what we're seeing now gradually from the emergence of the 19th century is a gradual change in the Ottoman period in which it's known as a state that's continuously reforming. And it is a state that is very different than any other state in the Ottoman past. This is what you can say the closest to what you could call a modern empire in that sense. Some people are reluctant to use the word modern, but nonetheless, the Ottomans had achieved this. Now, having said all of this, Reformation also created pockets of what we would call religious agitation and reformation. And so we start to see the emergence of the Naqshbandi movement as being far more powerful as a Sufi tariqat, which is close to authority and power, which is very pro-reform. We see the emergence of the Salafi movement in Bilad al-Sham and Egypt, and we see the emergence of the Wahhabi movement. And what's interesting is while all these movements in some shape or form, and I want to make a distinction between the Salafi movement and the Wahhabi movement at this period of time in Ottoman history, because they were quite different in that sense. What you see is these are movements in response to local issues and external issues. External issues because of the emergence of Western rationalism and scientism, that you start to see the development of new forms of Muslim thinking that are trying to counter that, and local issues because the manner in which reform was being done, it created forms of pockets of agitation in which you could start to see that different areas were becoming agitated by Istanbul. So what does this indicate? Well, once again, it makes the point that I said earlier, which is that Istanbul's rule over the Ottoman domains was never absolute. It was always a negotiation. And this negotiation at various moments and times in different areas could easily be broken if there was a sense of agitation felt by the local populations. And so the Ottomans are basically playing that game Guacamole, where they just keep smacking they try to improve the relationship here, and they will give concessions to one group of people, and that would agitate another group of people somewhere else in the domains. They would then try to make concessions to that group of people, and it would create agitations in another area of the domains, because as I mentioned before, it's a multi-ethnic empire to that degree, right? It's not uniformed in that sense. So the emergence of Wahhabism in particular was the agitation that the Ottomans were unable to protect the Crimea, unable to protect the Muslims in Egypt, and as a result, they felt that this was due to a decline in Ottoman religiosity, and so they revolt against that. The rise of the Salafi movement, once again, is because of the increasing sense of the emergence of Western rationality and science. And in Istanbul, the emergence of the Naqshbandi movement happens because of this huge migration of Muslims coming from Russia, who were part of the Naqshbandi tariqat in particular. And there was a feeling that people were turning away from issues to do with tasawwuf, which are Sufi practices in particular, and piety. And so there was a need to create that. So what's intriguing is not only was there a reformation taking place technologically and administratively, but you start to see a sort of impact of that on different groups and peoples and different ideologies, if we can call it that with a small I, of the emergence of how they felt Islam ought to be administered. So now you start to see this all coming together. In World War I, this all now brings it all to its head. We see the Ottoman military survive a long campaign in World War I, and that was mainly down to the reform effort. Because they had so quickly bridged the gap in the reform effort, they were able to survive that long in World War I as a result. But nonetheless, what people don't realize is when the war is that long, they lost a particular generation of men and intelligentsia in the first part of the war. And so the second part of the war, the second phase of the war, a new group of people took over and took the Turkish Republic in a different direction. We then see the decentralization of the Arab provinces, in which there is an expectation that we can return back to decentralization because many people felt agitated by centralization. And this is the argument, which is what's better, centralization or decentralization? Well, what we start to notice is that the pendulum keeps swinging left and right, which is there come moments in history where people require centralization, and then there are people who rebel against centralization and demand for decentralization. And we can even see that in the United States of America today, with the question of how much authority should the police have in regards to its centralization and decentralization. This is nothing new in that sense. Anyway, the Ottomans lose the Arab provinces in 1918, and then they focus all their efforts in Istanbul. But by and large, the Ottomans very quickly were able to use all the tools and mediums that were existing in the West. And so the idea that the Ottomans were unable to reform is actually not true. What basically smashes the Ottomans is how long World War I was. They never expected it to be that long, and the continued fighting. And you've got to remember that World War I was a period of plague, of sickness, loss of crops. There was a locust invasion, and then there was internal conflicts with different actors trying to safeguard their own interests, because for them, they believed that the Ottoman state will not survive it. The last point I'm making, because I think I've gone on for too long, which is one of the interesting things in which the British promoted at the time was the idea of the inevitability of the Ottoman collapse. And what we say as historians is it was not inevitable, but when it collapses, it consolidates the idea of inevitability. So if I keep saying today that Britain's going to collapse, it's inevitable. Britain's going to collapse, it's inevitable. And then one day, if it does collapse, I say, I told you, then it consolidates the narrative of inevitability. And so what the British were skilled at is they had been saying for the last 150 years of the inevitability of the collapse of the Ottomans. And in World War I, when it does collapse, it consolidates the mantra of inevitability. And so then people buy into the idea that this was inevitable. And so when the nation states are formed, they are formed on the back end of that narrative by saying, no longer are we interested in the Ottoman Empire. We want to start afresh, and we want to start new. Many of these nation states, to some degree, and the reason why Turkey is different from the other nation states is Turkey was able to benefit from the Ottoman reformation process, whereas the other nation states were colonized and had to implement institutions, structures, and systems by the colonizing powers. Turkey didn't have to do that. Where Turkey is unique, however, is it did colonize itself to some degree, but it did it on its own terms. But the reason why Turkey was able to survive in a very different way than the other nations is because of the success of that Ottoman reform project. And that's something that shouldn't be forgotten. And so you've got to remember that the war ends in 1918 for the Arab provinces, and the same in the Balkans. But in Turkey, the war continues until 1922, 1923. So there's a continuation of that. And the only reason why it survived is because of this. So this is what I wanted to explain to you guys today, hopefully. 45 minutes is a bit tough for me, but I hope I try to give you at least the complexity of the idea of Ottoman reformation and the sort of layers that are in it, and what we're trying to do as Ottoman historians.